Imagine your key employee needs to suddenly take extended leave. Is your business financially and structurally prepared to be able to handle that without a hitch? I'm Susan Bowles, and this is Beyond Margins, where we dive deep into creating businesses that not only survive, but thrive through unexpected challenges. We're wrapping up our series on sabbaticals, leaves, and breaks with a critical look at the structures that support these absences, finances, and human resources. From personal stories to operational strategies, this series has covered the spectrum. So if you missed the first 3 episodes in the series, I encourage you to go have a listen before you listen to this one. Today we focus on what underpins it all, the policies and financial planning necessary to support your team effectively, especially when it comes to planning for you or a team member to be out for an extended time. Kate Tyson is the owner and director of Wanderwell, a consulting and bookkeeping practices that grows thriving small businesses while investigating new models for being in business. Kate leads with the belief that businesses can help create a more just world that centers people, communities, and the environment. She's also my personal go-to when it comes to alternative business models and building equitable team structures. And Kate has recently been through the process of planning for paid parental leave for one of her team members. And she's planning sabbatical for herself later on this year. So, how does a small business with limited resources manage to offer comprehensive benefits like paid parental leave? That's what Kate and I are geeking out on today. Hey, Kate, how are you?
Hey, Susan. It's good to see you.
I am so excited to have you back on the show. So we have been talking about leaves, kind of parental leaves, sabbaticals, topics around how do we actually figure out how to make that happen. And you have a company that, at least for me, is one of those where you're kind of my go-to on creating a more inclusive, equitable kind of business model. And so I kind of wanted to start with the idea that your company does offer paid parental leave, which is pretty unusual for a smaller company. So talk to me a little bit about how you decided to implement that policy, why it was so important to you, and kind of how it came about.
Yeah. I think it's important to restate what you just said, actually, which is it's not unusual for a smaller company. It's unusual for any company in the United States.
That is fair.
Like, even amongst huge companies, I think it's fewer than 1 in 4 private sector workers have any access to any form of paid leave.
That's a pretty depressing statistic. So
yes. So not just smaller companies, larger companies as well. I mean, the immediate context, and I wish I had a different answer at this point, but it was really just out of necessity. We had a team member who was having a baby. So, I was like, okay. And that for some reason hadn't happened before. And so it hadn't come up. So then I started to go into this deep dive of like, okay, like what does that look like? And then I also went through a research deep dive on like, why is the United States so abysmally shitty about how we care or how we don't care for humans. So a lot of it was just driven by, we hadn't had any kind of extended family or medical leave prior to this. There's some circumstances where it might have actually, I wish we had it. I'm not sure it would have changed things, but I have had to exit a couple of employees historically by their own choice who had serious medical diagnoses and needed to take, leave work to receive medical care. So, this is like, all right, great. This is an opportunity to kind of like rethink things. But, once I started to get into it, I definitely have had this like, oh my God, we should have done this years ago. I can't believe we didn't have something like this. It's really important.
It's so important. And you're right. It is very unusual for it to exist at all. Talk to me a little bit about both the size of your team to kind of just give our listeners a little bit of a context to how many people you're trying to balance this at. And then talk to me a little bit about what you ended up deciding to have as your actual leave policy.
So Wanderwell in its current form is just 3 people, including myself. We're all client-facing and revenue-generating. We all have, I guess, books of clients ourselves who do different things. The other 2 folks besides myself are do accounting work and bookkeeping. So it's very important to say that is recursive.
It is there all
work.
the time, always.
Never goes
always.
away. It's it's cyclical, and so that's a really important context. The other big part of this, and this is a really important sort of we can get back into the nitty gritty, is that a lot of how you think about and design this will depend on what states you have employees in, because since we have no national anything, bigger companies are subject to FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. But that doesn't apply for smaller than 50 employees. And that doesn't provide any paid leave. It just means you can't fire people if they're pregnant, basically. There's some states that now, they're about, I think it's 13 states, and some of those are still, will turn on in 2025, so we're not even there yet, that have policies where they have created some form of paid leave requirements, disability insurance, different, and they look different. They all have a little bit of a different policy and things like that. A lot of it for us with designing it is we have Wanderwell moved from Philadelphia to Vermont in the last couple of years. So, the business is officially in Vermont. I'm the only person there. Vermont has some fuzzy stuff, and it wouldn't really cover me anyway, so it doesn't matter. And then the employee that's taking leave is in Washington State, which ended up being extraordinarily fortuitous because they have one of the best, most generous social policies, meaning the state actually funds and supports somebody taking time off. So a lot of it, I was designing with this particular team member in mind, but also trying to make sense of what is our actual policy going to be moving forward? And looking at, this person, it's very planned. That's the nice thing about parental leave.
Parental leave, you normally know about 9 or so months.
Most people don't have surprise babies, although unless you're adopting, maybe it is a surprise. But, we had some time. And so I was designing it based on her circumstances, but I know with looking at things, we ended up going with a broader set of circumstances. So the policy itself is a family and medical leave policy. So it covers all sorts of ways that you might welcome a new human into the world. It also covers caring for yourself, needing to take time off for your own extended
for that medical
sick leave. Yep.
Part. Yep. Okay.
Something that would be covered by a short-term disability sort of situation. And then also caring for family members who got sick. Because that's also come up, that's come up within my own business all the time.
Yeah.
Yes. Humans have bodies.
And families.
Have family members. And so these things come up. That's sort of all the context. What's tricky about this, and I've worked with a couple clients since about building out their policies, when you have multi-state employees, it gets very complicated because you have to kind of look at what states have different rules and who funds things. Does anybody else fund it? Can you have somebody else fund it? And that's all going to be driven by the state. So I had to kind of weigh, Washington's a bit of an outlier in that their funded paid leave policy will cover up to 16 weeks of salary for somebody.
So that's not bananas for the world, but man, is that really generous for anywhere in the US.
I know. Yeah. I mean, the world's average is 6 months.
Yeah.
This sounds crazy here, but it's really not. So they'll cover up to 90%, which is also a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, there's almost nothing that will cover. I think I'm comfortable saying there's nothing that will cover 100%.
That feels fair.
Feels fair. But Washington covers up to 90%. So, but 16 weeks is an outlier. So I ended up setting our policy at 12 weeks because that was sort of the standard.
That seems to be a little bit more common.
Yeah. I mean, it made it match where the other places where we've had employees and would employ people. So this employee's taking 16 weeks. The 4 additional Wanderwell's not paying anything about it. It's officially unpaid, except she'll be paid by
the state.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
But there's some stuff like that you have to kind of balance out, which is like, I would love for people to be able to take that much, or six months even, but that's not really feasible in terms of like equitable treatment of different employees under different circumstances. And that's one of the weirder part and like complicated parts about figuring this stuff out.
And especially if they're in different states that have different benefits. If you just happen to be lucky enough to live in a state that you can extend, you're right, not equitable, but you might as well take advantage of the fact that you happen to live in that state.
Right.
So when you were thinking about like 12 weeks, 16 weeks, looking at the different states, when you were setting 12 weeks, did you set the 12 weeks on the assumption that your company would end up, like, were you planning on the company funding that leave with potentially other people funding if they happen to live in a state that has benefits?
Yeah. So the way I worded it, and you can steal this if you're listening because it works well. Wanderwell will fund up to 40% difference between any third-party benefit. So that could be like Washington State has a social funded thing. It basically works like unemployment insurance. New York State, where we also have an employee, they also have a mandated paid leave.
Yeah, they have like a you pay in like it's unemployment insurance, sort of.
You pay it, well, you actually obtain disability insurance for New York State. So it's like you pay in, similar, it's like another payroll deduction thing, but it's disability insurance. So it has a sort of narrower scope. Like Washington's stuff will cover a broader range of circumstances. So again, this is like where it gets really weird.
It gets really weird. And, you know, most of the people I work with, I'm sure a lot of the people you work with, like we have multi-state employees. That's very, very common now.
Yep. Yeah.
And it does make HR and benefits and all of that so much more complicated than it needs to be.
Yes. That's a whole rant for another day. Yeah, totally. So I plan to sort of figure out like, well, what gap do I feel comfortable committing to in the future? Like, it's not going to be 100%. Like, with knowing that we'd have to hire coverage and stuff like that, that would mean floating a whole extra payroll.
The whole person, yeah.
For a whole person, basically a whole free person. That seemed too much. So set it at 40%. Under a lot of circumstances, that means that somebody will end up getting 100% of their salary for that 12 weeks between, like, under the circumstances of, like, who's employed at Wanderwell, what states we have right now. That covers a lot. Now, there's still stuff it doesn't cover. Like, somebody in New York State wanting to adopt a child and take time off, like, wouldn't cover that.
Okay. They would get something versus at a lot of companies they would get
nothing.
Sorry, too bad, so sad. Hope you can figure out how to survive this or come back to work immediately after you've had a kid.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So you have one of your team members who's out right now on that parental leave for 16 weeks. And as you mentioned, there's 3 of you. And you're not doing project-based work. It's not like you could just be like, okay, great, we're just going to pause all the projects that person is going to work on. So that's a really big lift for 2 other people to take on a whole person's job. So tell me a little bit about how you approached actually planning for this person to be away for, a good portion of the year, actually.
There's a couple chunks about it. I think... it's nice with babies that you have a bunch of time. There are certainly circumstances in the realm of what we're talking about where somebody could need to leave with very little notice.
Yeah, for medical stuff, for
medical stuff, for illness, whatever. And that would be like a whole different sort of triage situation in terms of like the coverage and stuff like that. The timing worked out impeccably in terms of the realm in which we're talking about, because this person's due date was like end of February, beginning of March, which puts us just on the other side of bookkeeping busy season.
That's That's such perfect timing because you
I
finished
know.
all the year-end stuff.
I know.
That's
like,
so
if it
great.
had been a January 2nd baby, that would have been really difficult.
That would have been really hard.
So we looked up it in that way, and that we could plan to kind of close out the year with everybody, and then sort of turn to like, okay, operation transition. So some of it was figuring out like, okay, what coverage do we need? Like, where can we move work around? I ended up having some personnel changes happening like in the fall, winter, and really got lucky because a former employee ended up coming back and being like, can I come work? Can I come back? So rehired her. So didn't have, Charity was familiar with some of the clients and training and stuff like that.
And all
so
the
that
systems
really
and everything.
helped. Yes. I knew this like from the fall, I knew that what like all of the timing and all of these circumstances at some point in the fall, I don't remember exactly. So I had, at least a quarter of kind of planning time ahead. So even I think 3 months out, I talked to a freelancer that we use sometimes in project work and got her committed and looped in, started to sort of figure out like our communication plan, how much overlap we would want to have. Like, especially with like the kind of work we do, somebody can't just pick it up day one without any prep and know exactly what to do.
Right.
So we ended up planning for about 3 weeks of overlap for everybody.
Okay.
To do a bunch of planning. So that was like freelancer came on, started to shift stuff onto other team members' plate and like do some like a bunch of training on specific clients and like their particularities during that part. So by the time employee was going on leave, we'd already had about 2.5 weeks. Baby ended up coming. She ended up having to leave early, which I also sort of anticipated. I was like, we're gonna front load this. We're not in control here. So
we're gonna try.
We use that 3rd week as like buffer of like, let's pretend like you're gonna have most of everything kind of wrapped.
Yep.
And in this case, we have a defined number of clients, so we know who they are, we know what that looks like and stuff like that, so we could kind of figure out the plan of who got what that coverage was going to look like and that plan. So that's sort of one big chunk of it. The other big part is just around systems, like, and documentation and all of those things. I hadn't even thought about this as an issue because we have so much of that.
Right. I mean, and bookkeeping and finance work lends itself well because it's very repetitive and you're doing mostly the same thing. And a lot of it crosses from client to client. Tell me more about what you ended up feeling like you needed.
So we have a lot. We have extensive checklists and templates and blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, every client is unique and has their own quirks and particularities and journal entries and sales tax and blah, 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 blah. So there was stuff to like plug in. We have process documentation for every client already.
Okay.
And those are the kind of things that like in an idealized world would get updated all the time. In reality, of course, don't, because that's just not how people work. So some of it was like just identifying like what details did we need to update. Were there like Loom videos on particular like complex accounting practices that are particular to a certain client that would be helpful as reference? So there's some kind of like reference materials that got built out that were particular to like, this one thing is kind of a 12-step nightmare, so I'm going to Loom video it for you. And then like, so I would say largely this is like one of those good stress tests.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, just imagining trying to do this for a client will show you where your holes are. And this was one where I was like, oh no, actually, this is like the least of it.
So let's talk about the financial aspect. So as we were talking, you're now paying 40% of somebody's salary that they're not. Well, you're not.
Washington State is very helpfully paying pretty much
most
all
of it.
Washington State's paying 90%. They also have a grant for small business owners if you have to hire temp coverage.
Man, I'm moving to Washington.
I know. I mean, it was such a pain in the ass to set up employment stuff there. I was grumbling for months about it. But now I'm like, no, never mind. I love Washington. This is great. Net, I think pretty much most of it's covered. There's like a little bit of extra payroll. We had a little bit of double up, at the beginning and at the end, because there'll be some transition stuff. So that part, like, we got really lucky. I will say, though, the other big part about this, and this is like the prep and the financial part, is while, our work is recursive, we would normally open up new client spots if we had them in February, March.
Right.
And so in this case, I've like had this wait list sitting for far longer than we would normally do. And we're not going to open up any of those spots till we have full team back.
Until the team comes back. That makes sense. There's a combination of like planning the level of work and also making sure that you're working at a capacity that is manageable for the existing team.
Yeah. Like net, we're less profitable than we normally would be. And there's like a little bit of shift in sort of how the financials would normally flow. The really important part about all of this, though, is that even if somebody needed to go off today and have that 40% covered, that's fine. Like we have planned for profit savings to care for the team. Like that is one of the fundamental purposes of that.
And was that something that you created in conjunction with this policy, knowing that somebody might use it? Or you're like, do you have a separate reserve that you've set up as part, like, allocated for this kind of container? Or it's just you make sure that the level of your reserve is adequate to cover this if it comes up?
I just make sure that we have an adequate reserve at all times. Like profit's not just my personal business owner / fund. The entire team generated that value, and like we all get to use it to take care of ourselves. Like that's why it's there. So doing really dumb things like overexpending at the end of the year for tax purposes, like I don't do that. I tell everybody not to do that, like it's a bad idea, so some of it's just, and I would say since the pandemic, I've been more conservative about what I want our reserves to be like.
Likewise, like back before COVID, I think most of us financial professionals were like, well, you should have like, 3 to 6 months, but like it's not like a big deal because nothing's going to completely stop you. Like you'll have something.
Like, really?
And
yeah.
Now that we know that like things can completely stop for like a year, I think everybody has gotten a lot more conservative in terms of making sure that their reserves are really adequately funded. Talk to me a little bit about how it's gone, as this is the first time where somebody's like really gone for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
Like, has there been anything that you didn't anticipate or wished that you had prepared, or just you did a good job of preparing and things have been running pretty smoothly?
We did a really good job of preparing. The team did a fantastic job of preparing. I think there were also things that we prepared clients for. And we kind of over-communicated, and even still, I think there was one client that was like, oh, I didn't read any of your emails. I had no idea she was gone. And so it's like, you can't communicate this stuff enough. But we did let people know in advance, like, expect stuff to be not on schedule. Like the month of March, stuff will probably be late.
Talk to me a little bit about your approach in terms of communicating that to clients. Was it just an email? Did you do phone? Like, how did you actually approach letting clients know that this change was coming and how to prepare for that?
We just sent mass emails. I think the individual team members followed up like where as needed, sort of with the transition and just like letting folks know what was going on. Phone calls would be overkill, almost like I'm making a bigger deal about it than it needs to be, and sort of, like I feel like sometimes people want to like over reassure clients, and that's about their own anxiety about it more than what clients need. I mean, we let people know sort of that it was coming. They were going to get shuffled around with who their manager of their accounts was. Then we let them know who they were going to get, and also let them know like, hey, there's some things you should expect. We're going to be like doing this big changeover. Stuff will probably be off, could possibly be off schedule from what you're normally used to. And also let people know, like, if there's any sort of deadline pressure, let us know because we'll figure that out.
How far in advance did you start letting clients know?
Not that far. I think we let them know first thing like in January before sort of end of February. So maybe 6 weeks out.
Okay.
2 months out. We knew a lot longer than before we started telling clients about it because they don't need to know. It's like,
well, no, and it's going to make them more anxious. Like, I was curious if you went with the, hey, this is happening next week, don't freak out about it, or a longer term, because, different clients get anxious about different stuff.
yeah.
And so
yeah.
further out, then you might have like unnecessary.
Yeah. No, we didn't. We gave them, probably about 6 weeks max or something like that. The only things that we received as communication back were like effusive excitement and congratulations. So,
but I think that also speaks to the kinds of clients that you work with. A lot of us that have businesses that were trying to be more equitable or calmer or more really just kinder businesses we get to work with really cool clients that the reaction to, hey, I can't do this thing is, that's great. Take the time, take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And so I think that speaks to the kinds of clients that you work with as well.
We have a zero tolerance for assholes policy. So.
Same. How did you kind of manage that conundrum as you were thinking about offering the benefits or the leave policy? How did you balance the desire to make sure that everybody on your team is adequately taken care of and knowing that there really aren't, Washington apparently cares, but most of the other states don't, and they don't fund
Colorado
those programs.
Care.
I'm like, Colorado, Arkansas cares even less. But like, how did you balance that, knowing that in a lot of places, potentially that you might be hiring team members, there isn't a system at all. So you decided at, 40% was the right number for you. But can you talk a little bit about how you navigated kind of that dichotomy, that tension?
Yeah, I think some of it it's just the work of leadership all the time, which is balancing the immediate needs and circumstances with the longer term. So, like wanting to overcommit resources in the short term to care is neglecting the longer term project. You and I probably see this all the time with like payroll. I love helping people figure out how to pay their people more, but you also can't overcommit that because it'll kill your business at the end of the day.
Yes, it will.
I think some of it is just being really, like for me, is just being, I think, continuing to be clear about the longer term sustainability and stewardship and like what I felt like we can commit to within, the constraints of like, I still want people to have jobs in 5 years. So
right. Yeah.
Like, I'm not gonna, as much as it would be cool to like fund more of that, if it's gonna ultimately harm the business, that ends up harming all of the individuals in the business.
Yeah. So as you were thinking about your reserves, I think a lot of the time when we think about planning for a leave or a break or a sabbatical, some of those are planned and some of them are unplanned. Is your level of reserves set so like one member of the team could be gone at a time? Or did you consider or address the possibility like what happens if there are overlapping issues? Not necessarily likely in a team of 3, but I think...
I haven't thought about that too much. I feel like that level of worry and planning is probably more than I'm like ever gonna get.
Is my level of anxiety not your level of anxiety? I'm like, but what if the worst happens?
Yeah. I think the other part is like my personal life is also secure and abundant. And so like I'm well resourced individually. The business is well resourced. If something catastrophic happened, like I could absorb some of that risk personally too. Okay. So which is another way of saying that like there's a lot of choice. It's not like I'm leaving money in the business at my personal expense, which I think is important to say. Like it's balanced. Another way of saying is like this is just I'm ensuring I have choices, which is a good lesson to have like come out of the pandemic if you can create it. Like that's the point of having profit and resources. It's like caretaking future opening up choices. So I think that's sort of the like maybe the extent to which I don't think about it maybe as much as you have in detail, but
Are there other ways that you have built in outside of maybe financial resources or HR policies, like a leave policy? Are there other ways that you think about that or build that in to support your team, your clients, your community?
probably honestly at every level of work all the time. Like I think that for me that's sort of the DNA of how decisions are made. So this larger policy that we've been talking about, it's in alignment with a larger system of support already. It's always evolving depending on like who's in the business and what we all need. But, one of the baselines is just like my team is we're at the pretty far end of autonomy and freedom of work in that like people can set their hours whenever they want. It's really driven by like productivity, not hours. The way that I structure pay and things like that is not about time at all. Like we've pretty much taken time out of the equation altogether.
Say a little bit more about that, because I think that's something that a lot of people think about when they are pricing the services to outside clients, but not necessarily when it comes to working with their own team members.
I mean, one of the things about like accounting and bookkeeping work is when there's a heavy lift with new clients. And then there's certain inflection points in like the work we do. There's a lot of problem solving in it and a lot of like paying attention to systems and sort of what's happening in business.
Right.
But the baseline work of it gets more efficient over time.
Yes.
And so, like, if you pay folks, like, there's a lot of norms around paying people in those positions hourly.
Hourly, yeah, that's kind of the industry standard.
Yes, and it's a very dysfunctional framework because it means that the best employees will be undercutting themselves because they will get faster and, like, more efficient, and so
they can deliver a lot more value to the business in an hour than a new employee or an inexperienced employee or somebody who's unfamiliar with the client. So how did you shift that?
Really, and there's certain circumstances where folks get paid hourly for a little bit at the beginning or whatever, but ultimately I put everybody's on a salary and it's benchmarked both like within our like framework of sort of level of skill and expertise, but also based on kind of level of client work. So it's really, at the end of the day, for me, it's tied to revenue. You have more revenue on your plate, you're just going to make a certain threshold of that. Like I've had situations with full-time employees that work 20, 25 hours a week and make a full-time salary. And that's fine.
Yeah, because they're producing a full-time amount of work and they're just really efficient about it. I love that.
There's already a sort of like baseline of folks working around their full lives and their other stuff going on and like whatever. And this supports the sabbatical too in a way. Like I don't talk to my team very much. We don't talk daily generally. Like there's a lot of space around sort of, I think we're more oriented towards focused independent work. And then, we communicate when we need to. And we have meetings and stuff like that. But
I think that kind of work culture where it's, defaulting to asynchronous work or defaulting to more autonomous work, I think it's hard sometimes for business owners to get to that point. It's hard for them to let go of the feeling like you need to control and you need to know exactly what everybody's doing at every single moment of the day. But ultimately, when you design your business to allow your employees to be very autonomous, to have a lot of control over how and when and the kinds of work that they're doing, ultimately, you're right. It allows you to then kind of lift out without disrupting anybody, where if you are, quote unquote, in control or you're in micromanaging everybody, it's so much harder for you to leave because you've basically made all of the people who work for you completely helpless to be able to do anything without you constantly being there. And that makes it so much harder to actually take any kind of break, whether that's a week off or a day off or, a month-long sabbatical or whatever. Shifting focus a little bit, but sort of in the same realm, you mentioned that you're planning a sabbatical for yourself for later on in this year. So I would love to hear about how you're thinking about approaching that, being that some of the stuff crosses over, but it doesn't all cross over. So, how are you thinking about planning for that now?
There's a lot of details I haven't worked out yet because this is something that's going to be end of this year. But I've been thinking about it for a while. And so I know that I'm going to take at least 6 weeks off.
Are you going to do it all in one chunk?
Yeah, I'm going to take consecutive at least 6 weeks off.
Consecutive 6 weeks off. Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to be in India. So I'm going to be rather unreachable for a lot of it. So there's some crossover, but I would actually say this is sort of a radically different project in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot harder for the founder and main person to leave than somebody who has a defined specific role.
That's part of it. Sabbaticals are obviously different. There's nothing else to fund them other than to self-fund it. They're about reset, deep time off, other interests, all of those things. It's not always true that founders aren't replaceable and you can't have people step in. Pertinent to this, there's a client I stepped in to do sort of fractional business management during one of the partners' parental leaves. And it's great. I got to do a bunch of home renovation of the business while they were out. And so there's some circumstances where you could have somebody else step in if you needed to. With the kind of work I do, I'm definitely not replaceable. Right. So we'll be working around sort of that. With the timing of it, I actually don't know that it really is going to impact much of anything. I usually have 2 to 3 weeks off of work around that time of year anyway. So some of it will be we close for winter break, everybody's off. I take a bunch of time around that year for sort of reflection and planning. I usually don't talk to clients till after MLK Day in January. So there's sort of a lot of space already built in. I think the other part, and this is sort of a secret of my business, is that January is bookkeeping busy season, December to February 15th. It's full on. But nobody needs me. They're my job is just to get out of everybody's way. I don't work in that part of the business in that capacity. So it's also a good time to sort of be out of everybody's way and gone because the team generally needs me the least then.
Because they're so busy.
Because they're just doing year-end closeout and 1099s and stuff like that. So that's sort of what some of the stuff I know. I think there'll probably be some not taking new clients on for a bunch of period around that and just being conscious of sort of when I'm starting up new cycles of work with folks or things like that. I have a bunch of long-term advisory clients, we'll probably just schedule around this and things like that.
So I'm curious, when you were thinking about taking a sabbatical and planning for it, did you intentionally plan the timing for this specific time of year that is slightly easier? A lot of people don't work for a lot of December and the beginning of January is pretty common. Was that intentional or just coincidentally happened?
A little bit of both. So I knew part of going to India is for an intentional trip and that will happen at this time of year. So I knew, that commitment was going to happen. And then at some point I was I lived in India for a couple of years in my younger days. And it's been hard for me to fathom even wanting to go back for a vacation length of time because I've only really spent 6 months at a time there.
Right.
And it's a big, complicated country to travel in and do anything in. Part of it was I know I want to go back. There's this thing I want to go back for. And I really can't fathom flying all the way across the country for 2 weeks. That seems bonkers. So And I had this brief moment of like, maybe I could work with a 12-hour time difference. And I was like, no, I'm just going to take this time off. Like,
That sounds like it's a really hard time difference too.
and I was like, you know what? Been doing this a long time. I think it's time to have a break.
Yeah. Have you taken any extended breaks before from the business?
I mean, I take a couple of 2-week vacations a year, and I have a pretty chill schedule these days, but I don't think I've taken like off email, offline. Like, I'm not going to talk to anybody for longer than 2 weeks.
So what part of the planning, I guess, are you most excited about? And what part is the most nerve-wracking?
I mean, the trip itself is the most exciting part of it to me, of like figuring out where to go. And I think for a lot of it for me is that like I've had an unusual life path and career path, and I spent most of my 20s wandering. I lived in India. I traveled a lot. I've done a lot of things. And I think that spaciousness and freedom has always been a touchstone for me in my life, period.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of this is wanting to sort of go back and like touch that spaciousness again. I don't know if there's any of it that's making me nervous, really.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have a lot. I mean, one, you have this kind of test case of somebody being out for a while, whether that's you but having any member out of a small team is really impactful. But also having the financial reserves already ready and prepared and saved to be able to dip into that. That's the point of having them.
Yeah.
So I mean, it sounds like you're well prepared, and it can just be something fun.
I think just trying to decide whether I'm like really going to be unreachable for the whole period, or whether there's certain things that I might need to like, if payroll doesn't happen for some weird thing because like some glitch happened in the universe, like,
right,
will they be able to reach me and make sure their paychecks could happen?
That is one of the real challenges with being a founder in a business where there isn't an extensive team. The team is just a few other people. And, whether it's an access issue or a knowledge issue, a lot of the times when a key team member, whether that's the founder or other leadership at a company, is completely unreachable, yeah, things can go wrong. And you might be the only person that actually has access to do this thing that you don't realize that they don't have access until you test it and you're like, oh crap.
I've had a bigger team, and I actually, this is going to be easier than with a larger team.
Well, and I think also, the way in which you design your business and your service and the way that you kind of approach delivering your services can have a big impact on what the end result of that is. Is there anything that you think we should talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
I think the biggest thing that I run into is often people having to confront the limits of what's possible because we don't take care of people in this country.
Say more.
I think it's imperative to design our businesses as systems of caretaking.
Agreed.
And at the same time, we can't replace the lack of social safety nets and the amount of risk that the government, this country, large private sector has decided to foist onto individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Like, small businesses are not equipped resource-wise to shoulder that gap.
Especially not without extensive ability to plan way, way ahead of time. And like you having a reserve already funded, knowing that there isn't a social safety net, knowing that likely there aren't other resources to care for your team members, having to take on that burden yourself, and also having that level of reserves needing to be significantly higher than if there were other social services to be able to take on some of that burden.
Exactly. Some businesses are better equipped for that than others. A lot of my brick and mortar folks, they can't do what I'm doing.
Well, no, because the profit margins are so small to be able to, like, they're already scraping it out as best as they can just day to day, much less trying to build anything in reserve because, those styles of business, the margins are so teeny tiny.
I always want to remind people that it's not a moral failing to have a system that doesn't support what you wish you could do in the world. And it also doesn't let you off the hook. There's like that tension that we always have to hold between the types of care that we wish we could support and create in the world and the ways that like the larger system fails that. But I think it's also an opportunity to like think about alternatives to like, how do you actually support this? Because at the end of the day, it can't just be your own individual little business. There has to be a larger system if we're going to get to 6 months of paid time off to care for a new baby.
As we close out our series on planning for sabbaticals, leaves, and breaks, it's clear that taking time away from your business doesn't just happen. It requires intention, preparation, and a supportive framework. Over the past 4 episodes, we've explored everything from personal experiences and operational strategies to the crucial role of finances and human resources in supporting these absences. Today's conversation with Kate really highlighted a critical aspect of this process: financial and structural readiness. Kate's approach at Wanderwell offers a really powerful model for small businesses who are aiming to provide substantial benefits like paid parental leave, even within the constraints of really limited resources. So if you're thinking about planning a leave for yourself or one of your team members, here are some strategies to think about incorporating. First, start planning as early as you can. Having a clear, detailed plan for what to do can really make a difference. You can even create a plan for what to do for unexpected or unplanned leaves. You can take advantage of things like lazy training, or you can do a fire drill test like we discussed in the last episode with Layla Pomper. Second, make sure you're building robust cash reserves when you can. Maintaining an account specifically to cover things like leaves ensures that your business can support both expected and unexpected absences financially. And you don't have to build this all at once either. A little bit at a time can still, over time, build up a decent cash cushion. Third, make sure you communicate clearly and effectively. Whether you're letting clients know about temporary changes in your team, or you're discussing leave plans with your employees. Clear communication helps manage expectations, it helps maintain trust, and it makes sure that nothing gets missed while somebody is away. And last, consider the policies that you have in place in your business right now. Think about where you can create policies that specify how leave happens, how it gets paid for, or otherwise supports you and your team members when you're thinking about all the different leave scenarios you need to plan for. Effective and well-written policies might be kind of boring, but they actually create a plan for what should happen in both unplanned and planned leave situations. When they're used properly, they can make sure that everyone on your team can take the breaks they need and can care for both themselves and their communities. So as we wrap up this series, think about the structures within your own business. Are they resilient enough to handle a key team member's absence? What steps can you take today to begin crafting a more supportive and sustainable environment for everyone involved? Pick just one thing that you could start working towards today. It doesn't have to be as big as a whole leave policy, but maybe it's documenting one procedure or picking one person to get trained in a new part of the business. Tiny actions can make a really big difference. Now, looking ahead, our next series is going to dive into the different types of capital and funding options for service-based businesses specifically. We'll explore both traditional and innovative financing options. We'll uncover some strategies for managing your cash flow, and we'll discuss how to align your funding choices with your business's values. So, if you've ever wondered about the best ways to fund growth or to manage your financial resources, you won't want to miss this. And if this series has given you new insights or helped you think differently about planning for leaves or sabbaticals, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Sharing your thoughts not only supports our show, but it helps other business owners find us, and I really appreciate it.